ladies and gentlemen, let me say what a great honor it is to be in Macau for this year's Macau Forum, and what an important and auspicious time it is. The world, as you've been hearing from the speakers, is increasingly focused on the urgent challenge of sustainable development. And there's no question that the future of the world depends on the decisions in Asia, the world's most populous region, the world's most economically dynamic region, and the region, therefore, that will guide the world decisively in the 21st century. And no country will play a greater role in that than China. Within Asia and the world's largest country, and also the most remarkable economic dynamism the world has ever seen. And yet, with all of the economic dynamism, we face increasing challenges and even grave threats for the planet. And it is to combine the economic, social, and environmental challenges that is the great and so far unsolved problem before all of humanity. It is, in my view, a unique challenge to our generation, because the problems that need to be solved have never before faced humanity. Never before have we been so populous and so economically dynamic that human activity actually threatens the planetary ecological boundaries. It's the first time in human history that this challenge is faced. And so it's a great honor and pleasure for me, but also I regard it as a remarkable opportunity to meet together today to discuss these challenges. The world is increasingly aiming to live under the rubric of sustainable development. And there is a very good prospect that within the next 2 years, the world's governments, within the context of the United Nations, will adopt sustainable development goals. Because sustainable development was agreed this past year at the important Rio+20 summit to be the guiding principle for the next phase of global economic history. So we have to ask first, what does sustainable development mean? In China, the concept of ecological civilization is close to the concept of sustainable development. Sustainable development means that society should aim for 3 simultaneous objectives: economic development, social inclusion, meaning the broad base of prosperity in society, and environmental sustainability. Now, the truth is, it's difficult enough to achieve even one of these objectives. So to achieve all 3 of them simultaneously is a profound and so far unmet challenge. I have to emphasize, unmet by any country in the world and unmet by any region in the world. It is an aspiration that requires new and novel solutions. Oops. There. Unfortunately, the world as a whole is off course regarding sustainable development. We are not achieving sustainable development, though this is our shared aspiration. First, there is too much extreme poverty that remains in the world. More than 1 billion people who struggle for their daily survival. Second, there is high and rising inequality in our societies. This is true in my own country, the United States. It's true in many parts of the world. It is true in China as well. With the vast development, there have been widening inequalities of income and wealth. Third, we are in an era of severe environmental degradation. There is no question about it. In fact, the geologists in the world have given a whole new name to our era. They call it the Anthropocene, which comes from Greek, meaning the era in which human beings dominate the dynamics of the physical earth, in climate, in water, in nitrogen, in phosphorus, in other fluxes. Humanity is now the main driver of the planet for the first time in the 4.5 billion year history of the Earth. And finally, the world's population continues to grow rapidly. Not as fast as it once did in percentage terms, but still increasing by 75 to 80 million people every year. We have reached 7.2 billion people. We will reach 8 billion by 2024. We will reach 9 billion people, according to the UN forecast, by 2044. And unless we change course, we will exceed 10 billion people by the end of this century. I applaud China's population policies for having slowed China's population growth. I think this is enormously to the benefit of China and to the world. And yet other regions with high fertility rates need to take similar steps, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where the fertility rates remain above 4 children per household, and in many poor families above 6 or 7 children. This is leading to a rate of population growth that is absolutely unsustainable, not only for these households and these societies, but for the world as a whole. Because Africa's population, would exceed 3 billion people by 2100 on the current trajectory. And this would not be in Africa's interests, nor in the world's interests. There is no part of the world that escapes from the environmental threat. This is my own city, New York, in early November, underwater, flooded, without electricity for a month in major parts of the city. This is a place that calls itself the most sophisticated center of the world economy, and yet it couldn't even keep the lights on for weeks. It was so flooded that transport, electricity, basic public services stopped. Whole hospitals had to be evacuated because they couldn't sustain their populations. This was a disaster in a place that prides itself on being one of maybe the highest income part of the planet, and yet it is subject to the same environmental threats as everybody else. This is Beijing last year, also flooded the same way. The two great capitals of the two leading countries' economies of the world, both hit by environmental threats. This is Bangkok in late 2011. We know that there is no part of the world that is avoiding these threats. And this picture, if you can see it, is the grain crop of the United States in the middle of last year. We had the worst drought in modern American history. More than 50% of the counties of the United States were without rainfall, and the drought was extreme. We lost more than a quarter of the grain crop in much of the United States, and this pushed up grain prices worldwide dramatically. It put more people in hunger more poor people a threat of their lives. And this again is one of the so-called breadbaskets of the world. This is a map showing the extent of the drought that hit the United States this past year. And there's little doubt that long-term climate change is playing its role in events like this. And this is a drought in Africa. When it hits in Africa, people die by the millions. This is a place in West Africa, in Chad, that experienced a massive drought, and next door to Chad, in Mali, not only was there drought, but there was the outbreak of war that was made far worse by this environmental catastrophe. This is a map showing the environmental shocks that hit every part of the world. Floods, droughts, extreme storms, typhoons, of course, rising sea levels worldwide. We are in an age of massive increases in numbers of disasters, in massive losses financially and in human terms from environmental shocks. It's hard for you to see in the back rows, I'm afraid, but this is a graph prepared by one of the leading insurance companies showing the steeply rising number of major climate-related disasters in the world, which has been going up sharply decade by decade over the last half century. This map is even harder for you to see, but I'm going to just describe it because it's rather shocking. My colleague at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, Professor James Hansen, is America's leading climate scientist. He has been describing the progression of human-induced climate change for decades. He's been warning the U.S. government and political leadership. They have not been paying attention, I have to tell you, because they're so interested in the short term that they're not watching the long term. We don't have 5-year plans. We don't even have 1-year plans. And what Professor Hansen has been saying is that the number of extreme events in the world, that is the shocks of temperature and rainfall, has been rising dramatically. This is a series of maps, which I can't describe in detail, but was published in one of the world's leading scientific journals, showing that the number of extreme events that only occurred around 2 out of every 1,000 times during the 1950s are now occurring 50 to 100 times each year in the current decade. In other words, events in heat and drought, which only occurred much less than 1%, are now occurring 5 to 10% of the time in any given year. This is a measure of how quickly we have entered a new era in human history. And yet we seem unable globally to take this as seriously and urgently as is needed. This is another map which shows something also dramatic. The yellow and the green areas on the map are the so-called dry regions of the world, the arid regions of the world. The red triangles are the conflict zones of the world where there is fighting. And you can see the overlap of dry lands and conflicts. This is because the dry lands of the world are increasingly hungry regions, whether it's Mali or Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan The underlying driver of conflict is hunger. It's not politics. It's not ideology. It's hunger. And unless we address truly the underlying challenges of food supply, water, climate sustainability, we will face more conflicts, not fewer conflicts, in the world.